One. We're going to talk about and have an assignment on television, children's television, and also cartoons. I want to talk about kind of the development of children's television, which runs congruent with the development of television in general. And I want to see how kind of children's programming has figured out a niche in terms of advertising to children, speaking to children, and also teaching kids, myself included, language, law, our values. And I learned it from things like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers and the Electric Company when I was really, really little. And then later on Saturday morning cartoons, which was a real phenomenon in my generation in the 70s and 80s, and I think even going into the 90s, where cartoons were on just a couple of networks and every kid kind of was watching the same shows. And I want to show you how it developed, how it got absorbed by commercialism, and I also want to begin to talk about the simulacra that we see between live action TV and also cartoons as well. So let's get into that. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know how much I'll be able to show you without getting censored. So you have the PDF. All the links are live on the PDF, and I'll discuss a number of the shows. Your assignment will be to watch a few of the shows, and we'll comment on some of the shows. But I'm not sure how much I can really watch them with you and contextualize. Now, again, if this was a live class, that's for sure what we would do. But, here we are with our online class. So here we go. So this is the cover kind of explanation for this lecture. I have to say that getting paid to be academic about cartoons, music, and getting to give you college credit for watching cartoons and listening to hip hop and rock and roll and discussing memes. I really, really enjoy this part of the class. I don't see any reason why academia can't include this stuff. And one of the things I learned in putting this class together is something I learned from Sesame Street. And what I learned from Sesame Street in terms of them making it, they discovered that if you educate or if you entertain a child, you can educate a child. And I think that's just as true with teens and young adults and old adults like me. I think that's absolutely true. So we're going to study the effects of children's TV programming from educational TV to cartoons. We will see TV changing from programming designed to teach kids language, laws, and values. In many studies, researchers have observed how educational programs can aid in boosting children's intellect. Surprisingly, children's aged 2 to 7 who watched a few hours of educational television programs per day perform better on academic tests than those who didn't watch TV. I don't think that's too surprising, right? So we'll study shows like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Sesame Street, and also see cartoons like Schoolhouse Rock and some really cool songs as well. We'll study children's TV also as just pure entertainment. In particular, I want to share some stuff from my childhood, like H.R. Pufnstuf from Sid and Marty Krofft and Lost in Space. And then we'll also look at how television was deregulated in the 1980s to allow cartoons to become long-form commercials to sell toys for shows like Masters of the Universe that was sponsored by the Mattel Company to sell their He-Man action figures in 1982. We also see TV, and we see that in the image here, of it acting as a simulacra, a representation or imitation of a person or thing, which is a sociological theory by Jean Baudrillard that teaches us how media imitates the real world. and supplants it as a reality. We no longer know what the original is and that it is copied. That's kind of the concept of simulacra. In our study, we'll see how a TV show called The Honeymooners in the 1950s becomes a cartoon titled The Flintstones in the 1960s. So that's where we're going with this. Okay, let's get into the weeds into this. All right. So, what is children's television? Television programs designed for children, broadcast in the morning and afternoons when children are awake. And we also see kind of satire parodies of that with, I think, TV shows like South Park that on the surface might appear like a children's cartoon, but when you listen to Cartman's filthy, filthy mouth, you realize quite quickly it is designed for an older audience. So we see shows kind of capitalizing on our childhood interests in things like cartoons as well, and then trying to turn it into more adult humor. Children's programming is targeted generally towards a couple of different age ranges. 2 to 11, that is divided also into preschool, 2 to 6, where I think Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street that we see here on the slide are aimed at, and then also a pre-tween and tween demographic of 6 to 11, and then there's also categories for adolescents as well, and we'll see kind of shows like that too as we go along. So the preschool programming is more overtly educational, and certainly this is Sesame Street. Now, what's really great in this lecture is I have live links to a lot of stuff here. So these might be shows you know, these might be shows you might want to check out, and maybe a minute or two to see what they look like. There's a lot here for you, I think, and you could spend a lot of time on this, even though I imagine this lecture is not going to be too long. So Sesame Street is debuted in 1969 when I am 2 years old. And when Sesame Street first comes out, we have two different parts to Sesame Street. We have a street life where we have real life people who are living in a city and they're teaching children about how people in cities live, especially people of color that you might not know if you live in the suburb or out in the country, kind of where I lived growing up. I'm from a town of 5,000 people in Illinois. So the kind of people that we're looking at, the kinds of scenarios, were not something in my everyday life. Not that I knew much about everyday life at age 2. The second part of Sesame Street were the Muppets, and in particular Bert and Ernie, these two Muppets that kind of lived together and kind of fought together, but still seemed to like each other. And children my age in particular, we were really tuned into the Muppets. But when they would show us the street scenes with the adults, we'd kind of zone out. So Sesame Street kind of retooled itself very quickly, and that's where they added Oscar the Grouch and Big Bird into the street life scenes. What they realized is that as long as there were Muppets on the screen, we would be tuned in and we would watch. So the idea that they discovered is kind of what I just shared with you. You can educate a child if you entertain them, and that's exactly what Sesame Street figured out. And I have to say, I have kind of figured out an educational pedagogy from what they're saying that I fully believe in, and is really, really the aim of this class, is for us to be entertained, and in that moment where we're being entertained, we're also learning things as well. Now, there's a number of children's shows that are adapted from children's books, stuff that we see in the 1990s, like Blue's Clues, Dora the Explorer that I have a link to, the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse I have a link to, and it is somewhat, Mickey Mouse in particular is a pseudo-interactive program in which the action of the show stops and they break the fourth wall and look at us and address us directly as if they're really in the room with us, which I think to a child who doesn't maybe understand the fantasy of TV versus reality completely, I think that's probably very effective. So shows that are aimed for 6 to 11 and 12 to 17-year-olds, so a little bit older now than Sesame Street. So these shows often have comedic slapstick or they're action oriented. One of the best known of these kind of shows is the Power Rangers franchise, which I also have a link to. Many shows are also targeting boys in the case of these action series as well. Also, there's now programming shows in the early 2000s, and one of them that hits a particular a demographic that was pretty successful was Arthur. Um, Also, an older demographic, 12 to 17, in the bottom image, we're looking at live action series that are dramas and sitcoms and comedies. Maybe the teenagers we're finding maybe more crude humor that we wouldn't maybe want to show to younger children, maybe more adult situations, maybe more sexuality. And certainly there are a number of shows like this. And I think Saved by the Bell, which you have an image of, is often tackling kind of really important subjects to this demographic of 12 to 17, underage drinking and drug use and dating and rejection and all of that kind of stuff. A early history of TV. So early shows like Howdy Doody and Captain Kangaroo. What I didn't realize from these shows, Howdy Doody is a puppet that is a cowboy. Captain Kangaroo is kind of a pseudo cowboy. I didn't realize that the reason they had this kind of cowboy theme is that Westerns were very, very popular on the radio. So taking Westerns from the radio that kids listen to television shows for kids is kind of kind of the explanation as to why these early shows kind of had that format somewhat. Ding Dong School, which I didn't really know about until I started doing this lecture, is a woman who is sitting in front of a camera and simulating small talk with us at home and demonstrating basic skills for the camera. Now, Winky Dink is really strange. So here, they're teaching you how to draw. So you would buy a clear vinyl screen and affix it to the television and then draw pictures to match what was going on screen. Now, the problem with this is early TV had a lot of issues with radiation, and also kids didn't really know the difference between the fake vinyl screen and the real television screen and were causing a lot of damage. And the show doesn't last very long, but I do highly recommend kind of taking a look at this to see what that looked like. And then the later shows for young children, again, Sesame Street. And my favorite show was The Electric Company. I think The Electric Company was really groovy compared to Sesame Street. And it really, really excited me in ways, and again, introduced me to black culture in ways that, again, in my everyday life, I wouldn't have known about. And of course, Mr. Rogers. And we'll talk a little bit more about Mr. Rogers in a second here. 1990s children's television. Kind of the beginning of the end for this kind of broadcast TV where everybody's watching the same shows at the same time. Even though VCRs exist, we still don't have a lot of options, and these things are, again, broadcast live. So we're getting more shows like Barney and Friends with the purple dinosaur, and again, educational messages, songs, and dance routines, and kind of this friendly, huggable kind of world that they live in. Blue's Clues is another pretty interesting show that has a live action, a guy, and then this blue dog. What we have found out recently is that Blue Even though Blue is a girl. And in the show, Blue had a girlfriend. So now, what it obviously, a Blue's Clues is telling us is that this was a lesbian relationship that Blues was in, that again, I think was not really understood in many of the shows. I think a favorite that many of you might know is SpongeBob SquarePants. A It was basically the anti-Bart Simpson, where rather than having a crude skating kind of anti-hero, SpongeBob is kind of cute and he's altruistic and he's happy and really blind to the faults of the world of those around him. Um, Bear in the Big Blue House is a Muppet Show, and The Big Comfy Cow. Again, all of these we have links to that if you are curious, you can see how they work. Now, in the United States, early children's television was often marketing. There's an example here of the Magic Clown, an early TV show in black and white that was the entire show was an advertisement to sell this taffy, and you see the kind of the taffy logo in the background for the entire show. So early TV was not hiding the fact that TV existed simply to sell you stuff. And the programming was fluff to fill up time because you weren't just going to watch advertising and commercials all day. So you had to hide it and make it look like it was entertainment. That kind of continues, although in the 60s and 70s, there does seem to be more of a stress on educational TV and a little less overt in the advertising. In the 1980s, though, the FCC that had prohibited tie-in advertising decided that the regulations don't apply to cable. And because of that, we start to see shows like G.I. Joe, My Little Pony, She-Ra, the Princess of Power, and He-Man. We are just getting cartoons that, again, are long-form commercials. And again, I don't necessarily think that they're less entertaining. I just think that when you realize what they're doing, it's hard to separate the advertising from the cartoons itself. Non-educational children's television. A lot of really great stuff in here. One of the things that I particularly loved growing up was Lost in Space. It was based on a novel from 1812 of the Swiss family Robinson. They're marooned on an island and they gotta kind of live with all this danger around them. Well, they've taken that show to outer space with a kind of trash talking robot and kind of this kind of skeevy kind of character in Dr. Smith. I have a kind of interesting explanation on that and a clip. This is a show that is still tightly guarded, and you can't find free episodes of this anywhere. A show that I'm really excited to share with you is H.R. Pufnstuf. H.R. Pufnstuf, here is an image from it here, is the first of the shows by Sid and Marty Krofft, where they're using kind of puppets and live action. And we have this boy who is on a boat and then gets kidnapped by a witch and ends up in this magical land that seems like it's a full-blown psychedelic acid trip and is really wild stuff. And I think it did a lot to make, I think his name is Jack White. We should look at this a little bit later. It made him into a big star. And then also the success of this brought a lot more of these puppet live action shows and made Sid and Marty Krofft really big in the entertainment industry. Another thing that was really great in TV was the Cartoon Empire of Hanna-Barbera. So this was an animation studio that didn't have a lot of money, and so they created a lot of cartoons like Huckleberry Hound, the Flintstones, the Jetsons, Johnny Quest, I have a link to that. Scooby-Doo, I have a link to that. The Smurfs have a link to that. Hong Kong Phooey, probably my favorite of all of the shows, with Scatman Crothers as the titular character. Their animation was kind of anti-Disney. They didn't have a lot of money. They looped a lot of things. And I think a lot of the success of their show was in the voiceover characterizations that they were doing. It was really quite a lot of fun. Now, the phenomenon of Saturday morning cartoons, this is something that I definitely grew up with. I would get up at about 5:30 a.m. Television didn't used to run 24 hours. It would be off air. And then around 6 a.m., it would start generally with like the Star Spangled Banner or something of the American flag. And then it would begin programming. And it first started with a show called Davy and Goliath, which was claymation, which we're going to watch. And it was a show that was sponsored by the Lutherans. It was a faith-based children's show that was kind of before the mainstream cartoons began. And I would watch cartoons all the way from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. And then it generally ended with like American Bandstand and Soul Train, two music shows, one for white audiences, one for black audiences. FYI, Soul Train was the better overall program with better music. And so in the 60s and 70s, there are kind of these waves of cartoons. In the 70s, you get a bunch of cartoons based on live action, like the Brady Bunch and Star Trek and stuff like that. And then in the 80s, the success of the merchandising of Star Wars kind of convinced manufacturers that there was an enormous profit in developing intellectual property in cartoons and then selling toys. So the FCC's looser interpretation of regulations in how much you had to educate children in your cartoons, that kind of changes. And there's some really kind of cool stuff that happens here. One of the great shows was Super Friends. And certainly I was into comic books as a kid, and the DC comic books being turned into cartoons. And again, the kind of Super Friends part of it, really charming. And who knew that cartoons or comics would become the entertainment of our era in film like it is today? So I have a slide here that talks a little bit more about Sesame Street. I've kind of already described it. I have a link that shows you how the Muppets and you can see here Jim Henson, the guy that created the Muppets. This is Frank Oz here. He was one of the voice characters. You can kind of see how they would hold the puppets, and we're seeing the actual characters moving the puppets and the voiceovers in them. Along with the live action characters. Mr. Rogers is really something sweet, and I think really something that I loved as a child and felt kind of guilty about liking it as I got older. Fred Rogers is a minister who decided that he wanted to get into television, and he created this really charming world where he talks to you directly. He talks to you not like a child and talks down to you. He really kind of talks to you like you're at the same level as him. And he comes in and kind of puts on his sweater and takes off his shoes. And there were two parts to Mr. Rogers. There was a make-believe world that, again, was a lot of fun. And then Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers would take us to places we would see how people who work for the post office operated. He also did a very important show when the civil rights movement was going on, where he shared shared a wading pool with a black man, and they each kept their feet in the water together and they talked to each other. I learned a lot about the world and how to love people from Mr. Rogers, and I really thank him for that. Schoolhouse Rock. This shit rocks, I gotta tell you. Yes. This was stuff that I would see on Saturday morning cartoon. Usually it was bumpers in between commercials. Uh, and this was these were short songs and they really rock. I think Lolly Lolly Lolly, Get Your Adverbs Here is a great song. Conjunction Junction taught me how conjunctions work. But maybe the most important one of these songs was I'm Just a Bill. I'm Just a Bill taught me how government works and how a bill becomes law in a simplified manner that has really stuck with me through my entire adult life. And in our assignment, we're going to watch all three of these, and I hope you enjoy them if you don't know about them. I mentioned a little bit earlier about faith-based educational TV, the claymation. I love claymation. And Davy and Goliath was one of these. It was a show that was sponsored by the Lutherans, but they really never talked about the faith that they were in. There was a logo at the beginning of the show, or maybe at the end of the show, that described who was sponsoring it, but then they really kind of left preaching out of it. And we see this boy and his talking dog getting into scenarios that generally required ethical behavior, tolerance, forgiveness, you know, a lot of the lessons that religion often is trying to teach us. And then, of course, as I was saying earlier, the advertising television that comes along later. She-Ra is, I think, an interesting show here, and I have a full episode of She-Ra, and also the commercials that accompany She-Ra as well. So this is a spin-off of the He-Man Masters of the Universe, and again, a ton of toys that follow along with this too. The Flintstones. So I showed you the Flintstones in kind of the explanation for the lecture, where we saw that Fred, the titular character, was based on a comedian and a TV show called The Honeymooners. Him and his wife and his friends were all based on these live action characters that honestly I did not know about when I first saw the show. So to me, this was the original, not the copy, because I didn't know what the copy was. And I'm not so sure as a child I would have been that interested in the black and white live show from the 50s that was often, I think, in reruns. And I think I began to appreciate it a little bit later when I was when I was a tween, probably. So the show is based in the Stone Age, and they drive cars, and they live a very modern life. And there's a lot of jokes about, like, you know, how the typewriter is actually them chiseling into stone and stuff like that. A lot of fun, really. Scooby-Doo. Scooby-Doo is still popular. Some movies and television shows have come out on Scooby-Doo, and there has been really a queering of Scooby-Doo, and in particular, we are seeing that in their kind of periphery characters, where now the periphery characters who maybe had maybe butch or queerish qualities, now those are in shows where we're not going to even hide that. And I think that is pretty fascinating. And I do have an article here that kind of talks about the gay history of the character Velma, who now also, I believe, is a person of color as well. I don't know how much of the original show was aware of that or how much of that they were hiding, but that is definitely where they have allowed the speculation over the decades to come to fruition in the actual show. Again, as a child, I really loved Scooby Doo. It was a lot of fun. It's kind of a mystery show with a talking dog with his stoner buddy. And then, kind of the handsome guy and the pretty girl and the smart girl. And I had no idea that these characters were directly based on the show Dobie Gillis. And Shaggy, one of my favorite characters who was always with his pal dog Scooby, was based on Bob Denver, who played Gilligan later, this beatnik kind of stoner character with his dirty shirt and stuff. So again, like growing up, I learned, of course, that this was a copy of something, but my initial seeing these shows, I had no idea. And again, that's what simulacras do to us, is that so much culture is a copy of a copy, and a lot of times these copies are able to act and stand alone, and it doesn't necessarily matter that you know what the original is for you to enjoy the show. And the last slide that I have here in this half-hour lecture that we have is I talk about childhood development in television. And I think that there is definitely a segment of the population growing up that thought that television was terrible for children. It took us away from doing other stuff. The same thing that, adults say about you kids spending time on the internet. Same thing they were doing in my generation to kids watching TV. And then also, I think other people have said, no, no, no. Children actually teaches children things. And that's kind of what we're studying in our assignment, is that, things like Mr. Rogers taught me a lot of life lessons, Schoolhouse Rock taught me lessons, and many things I think helped me develop as a child. It wasn't just a babysitter that was a screen. Okay, so what are we going to do with all of this? So you have an assignment here, and in the assignment you're going to watch some of these shows and you're going to tell me about them. So I want you to either watch an episode of Mr. Rogers, there's a whole playlist, or watch this episode that I found of Davy and Goliath. And they both have faith-based underpinnings. Mr. Rogers is a Presbyterian minister. Davy and Goliath is sponsored by the Lutherans. What did you learn about values? How to behave, treat people, react to situations, think about the world, and also how obvious are the Christian undertones in the show? Are they obvious? Are they hidden? And do you think the shows that you watch, whichever one you watch, is effective in teaching young children values? Again, with the assignments, really be generous in terms of your expressing to me what you've learned. Don't be brief, because if you're brief, you'll be penalized in your grade. Then I want you to watch these 3 very short videos on Schoolhouse Rock. And then I want to get your opinion on these videos. And I want to get your opinion on all 3 of them. Which ones do you think are most effective in learning about law and grammar and language? Do you think they're effective? Do you not think they're effective, and why? Should these videos be used in a classroom to help young children learn? And do you think that they could be effective on children today? Then I want you to compare 2 shows. So, number 1, H.R. Pufnstuf, made to entertain children and enliven their imagination, no direct toy merchandising tie-in. I want you to see what pure entertainment without merchandising looks like. And then I want you to watch She-Ra, the Princess of Power, and I want you to watch the show, and I also want you to watch the commercials. So there's a video that shows all the different commercials. What are the obvious differences? Are there obvious differences in terms of entertainment, the use of imagination, pure commercialism between the 2 shows? And then also, should TV shows be aimed at children simply to sell merchandise? What do you think about that? Is that absolutely cool? Is that absolutely wrong? Is there gray areas? What do you think about it? I don't think it's necessarily a simple answer in terms of ethics. And then the last question is something I just kind of want you to reflect and think about, and maybe share this information with me. Did you watch any cartoons or shows from this lecture that you liked and didn't know about before? Did I show you things that you'd never heard of? And is there anything that you're kind of interested in because you saw them? Were there any of these shows that you saw when you were a child? Did you also watch Sesame Street growing up like I did? Did you discover the shows yourself, or did a parent or an older sibling show you the shows if you have seen them? And then the other question that I want you to answer, are there shows that you watched as a kid that you would want to introduce to your children? What would they be and why would you want to introduce those? So that's the assignment. I hope you have a good time with it. I hope you kind of enjoy kind of exploring this stuff, and I look forward to seeing your answers. Take care, everybody, and I will talk to you soon.